There is no easier way to whip a crowd into a frenzy than to convince them of a common enemy. Every despot in history has shown us that, and America today is full of similar sentiments against various groups right now. But it's increasingly obvious that the corporate news organizations might not just be exacerbating this problem, but perpetuating it, and even to some degree creating it as well. So today on Something's Happening Here, we look at the unfolding drama at NPR, which I'm more inclined to call the real-time suicide of NPR, as we build on Monday's show about the ongoing spiritual war playing itself out in front of our noses. Thanks for joining us today as we acknowledge what has been quite clear to some of us for a while now already. NPR is just another hack news organization. Welcome back, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Wednesday is the middle of most people's work week, and I'm so delighted that you choose to spend it with us. That means you are spiritually minded and you want to know what is happening here. As you look around the world, it's clear that something's happening here. I think it's clearer and clearer to more people as time goes on that what shows up in the news, what you can kind of see in your neighborhood, that's definitely not the entire story. So thank you for joining us. And today we are continuing our discussion from Monday by talking about something totally different. On Monday, we talked all about Iran, both in the 1970s and today, as they're mixed up in the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas. To follow up, we're going to talk about NPR. And when we're done talking about the drama at NPR, hopefully we'll be able to draw a connection there that will carry us forward into Friday's program. If you are not aware of what's happening at NPR, then first of all, good for you for not listening to NPR. But let me bring you up to speed. There is a reporter there who has been apparently working for NPR for 25 years. That is a long time. And he recently accepted an assignment. That's probably the wrong word, but he wrote a piece for an outlet that's not NPR, for this The Free Press publication. And then he got in trouble for doing so, but I don't want to get ahead of the story. The piece that he wrote for The Free Press is titled, "I've been at NPR for 25 years. Here's how we lost America's trust." So when I read the headline, my very first reaction was, great, now do the New York Times. But in any case, you should read this article. If you haven't, you should. And it's in the show notes for you. I'm going to read a portion of it that I think gets to the heart of the problem. This man, Berliner, I think is his name, Uri Berliner. He wrote this on April 9 of this year, so just a couple weeks ago, by the time you're watching this. And he writes this: back in 2011, although NPR's audience tilted a bit to the left, it still bore a resemblance to America at large. 26% of listeners described themselves as conservative, 23% as middle of the road, and 37% as liberal. By 2023, the picture was completely different. Only 11% described themselves as very or somewhat conservative, 21% as middle of the road, and 67% of listeners said that they were very or somewhat liberal. We weren't just losing conservatives, we were also losing moderates and traditional liberals. An open-minded spirit no longer exists within NPR, and now, predictably, we don't have an audience that reflects America. That wouldn't be a problem for an openly polemical news outlet serving a niche audience. But for NPR, which purports to consider all things, it's devastating both for its journalism and its business model. Now, you can and should read the rest of this, but before we put the article away, I'll give you a hint as to how Mr. Berliner claims that this transformation occurred, because it's in the very next paragraph or very next sentence even after I stopped reading. I'll give you two guesses. Like many unfortunate things, he says, the rise of advocacy took off with Donald Trump. Trump broke NPR, apparently, like he broke everything. All right. This is the problem. Mr. Berliner says that because the powers that be got it in their heads that the Orange Man was the worst thing ever to happen, and it was their job not to just report on him, but to do something active about it, right? To shape the news and to shape the minds of the people who consume the news. That because of that, fast forward just a handful of years, and it's no longer the news outlet that it always was. It no longer is the kind of um, facts only, middle of the road kind of you turn to us to find out what's really happening without all the spin. It's not that anymore. Now it's really just like a taxpayer funded CNN. And if you like, I used to tune into NPR every once in a while, read their stuff. You don't really even have to be like a dedicated follower of NPR to have realized this was happening over the last few years. All you have to do is be like moderately familiar with NPR to notice that something has changed. And Mr. Berliner says that this is devastating, although he specifically falls short of calling for NPR's defunding at the federal level because it does receive taxpayer money. He says the mission of NPR hasn't changed. The way they're executing that mission has. So rather than kill it by cutting off the funding, he wants he wants to hopefully kind of draw the whole organization back to being what it used to be. Unfortunately, I don't think that's going to work because the Orange Man is still alive and well, and he very well may be the next president. So I think whatever happened to them due to the first presidency of Donald Trump is unlikely to change in any significant way until at least the second presidency is over, or at least until Donald Trump falls out of the kind of mainstream spotlight for a different reason. But as long as he's still around, I don't think there's any change coming to NPR at all. Well, what happened to Mr. Berliner? I'll give you two guesses. Oh, right, he was punished. And so we turn to Fox News. And I'm only going to read one sentence from this article because really it just is a reporting on Mr. Berliner being suspended. It says NPR is under fire again, this time for punishing the veteran editor who took his concerns public about the liberal takeover of its newsroom. There's not a whole lot of surprises in this article. Mr. Berliner was suspended. He got a nasty gram. The pretense for his punishment was that he's apparently under contract with NPR and is not allowed to write for any other organization without prior approval from NPR, which automatically sounds really kind of fascist to me. I I don't like that. I don't like being beholden to anybody in that way, especially as a creative person, as a writer, as someone who creates things. I don't want you to tell me what I'm allowed to create, So just even assuming that that's true, that he did require somebody else's permission to write for the free press, that's bad in and of itself. So if that was really how it goes down over there, maybe getting fired, or he didn't get fired. He was suspended and then resigned. So he doesn't work at NPR anymore. But maybe that was a blessing in disguise. Brother Berliner, if I were you, I would be jumping up and down in my seat and feeling good about myself because the Lord has had mercy on you and has removed you from that horrible environment so that you can be free. In any case, what happened to NPR as a result? Absolutely nothing. So our final article for today is actually by NPR, and it is dated April 16. So what's the date on all these other things? April 17 is the Fox News article reporting on Mr. Berliner being suspended. So as NPR is suspending their whistleblower, they're simultaneously at the exact same time publishing this article. Could the US force treatment on mentally ill people again? Now, obviously, this has nothing to do with Mr. Berliner, with any of the drama we have just discussed. But the reason that I read through it and am using it on today's program is because everything that Mr. Berliner is accusing NPR of doing is on full display in this article. So it's like NPR heard this criticism, made a conscious choice to punish the man levying the criticism, and then made the further conscious choice to not change their playbook at all, to like literally double down on all the things that they just were exposed as doing. So here's an example, okay? From this article about mental health treatment. We read, in the mid to late 20th century, America closed most of the country's mental hospitals. The policy has come to be known as deinstitutionalization. Today, it's increasingly blamed for the tragedy that thousands of mentally ill people sleep on our city streets. Wherever you may stand in that debate, the reform began with good intentions and arguably could have gone much differently with more funding. So, let's stop. A, nobody cares about the intentions. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, okay? And yet, if you pay attention to the news the way I do, and if you pay attention to corporate media the way I do, you will quickly come to realize that one of the most common, most passionate defenses for any given failed liberal policy is that it was made with good intentions. Like, how dare you criticize this, even though it didn't work and it made everything worse, but it was done with good intentions. Are you a racist? You know, you hear this all the time. Now that I've just pointed it out to you, if you're not already aware of it, you'll hear it constantly. Just try to not hear it, right? It's all over the place. All right, so they just went straight to their kind of common playbook. Well, it was well intentioned, but then they went to like the second most common thing in their arsenal, which is like, it would have gone differently if it had been properly funded. In the 1990s, when Bill Clinton was president, and the economy was actually quite good, and we were actually paying down national debt for the first and only time in my entire life. I heard all these same criticisms about the Democrats, these like tax and spend liberals, and they never met your money that they didn't want to spend. And all those criticisms didn't mean anything to me because I didn't perceive any real difference between Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush. And I was too little to really compare it to Reagan. I mean, Reagan, I was in my single digits of age when Reagan was president. So, but I just didn't see what all the criticism was. I was like, what do you mean they're spending recklessly? We're actually spending less money and paying down the debt. Like, what are you talking about? Fast forward 30 years, this is on full display, isn't it? I mean, now that we're more than $30 trillion in debt, and before I even finish that sentence, just try to wrap your brain around what an astronomically large number that is. How very many zeros have to follow the number 3 to reach 30 trillion. It's astounding. There have not even been 30 trillion minutes that have passed since Jesus Christ died on the cross until this present moment, which means our government has spent money that it does not have in excess of $1 per minute of time since Christ died on the cross until now. Okay, my rant is over. So even today, when we are in so much debt that we'll never ever get out of that debt, like Jesus will come and we'll still be in this kind of debt. Nonetheless, President Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. still spends money like a drunken sailor and advocates for spending even more money. He dismisses any criticism that we have no money to spend, that it's reckless, that it's a national security problem. He doesn't care. Just like broadly, and this is not a universal statement for every single Democrat politician, but broadly, the Democrat politicians agree with him and are much more willing to call you some sort of derogatory name like racist, or I mean, that word doesn't even mean anything anymore because they use it for everything they don't like. Whatever you don't like is racist. than to actually listen to your criticism or do something differently. And ultimately, this is just me speculating, but I think the primary reason for that is because they all hate Donald Trump. So if Donald Trump wants to rein in spending, then by default, they have to not want to rein in spending. Maybe that's reductive. Maybe that's too simplistic. I don't know, but that's definitely how it feels to me just watching the whole thing from the sidelines. In any case, this article goes on. The very next paragraph says in October 1963, just weeks before he was assassinated, President John F. Kennedy signed into law landmark legislation that aimed to transform mental health care in the United States. Okay. If this is an objective news source, that's a lot of passionate language that you use to describe what's supposed to be an objective thing. I can guarantee you that if it had been a Republican president who had done the exact same thing, NPR would not have described it as landmark legislation aimed to transform mental. Like, do you see the word choice that they use is indicative of the kinds of things that Mr. Berliner was complaining about. And I guess a little bit they start to complain about Ronald Reagan. Yeah, okay. So both in the 1960s as governor of California and in the 1980s as president, Ronald Reagan was an important figure in cutting funding to community health centers. But this was only one part of a broader and bipartisan set of actions and inactions that have led to collective neglect for this vulnerable population. Did you catch it? Kennedy was transformative. Ronald Reagan, he was important in cutting the funding. No flowery language for him. And then it gets even better. Because what did we already determine was the root cause of NPR losing its collective mind? It was Donald Trump, right? So, of course, before the article ends, late last year, former President Donald Trump posted a video on his campaign website remarking, "When I am back in the White House, we will use every tool, lever, and authority to get the homeless off our streets." He continued, "And for those who are severely mentally ill and deeply disturbed, we will bring them back to mental institutions where they belong, with the goal of reintegrating them back into society once they are well enough to manage." Now, to me, that sounds pretty transformative. It sounds like landmark legislation proposals where we're going to actively get people off the street, which is the problem that has essentially destroyed California, is that these squatters and homeless have more rights than property owners do in the current state of things in California. And for those who cannot actively participate in that process, we're going to institutionalize them the way it used to be, which will get them the medical care that they clearly require, but are unwilling or unable to pursue on their own. And not just to punish them and get them off the streets, like was the common complaint against the former institutionalization system in the 60s, but to actually try to get them back into society with a better sense of mental health. All of that sounds like exactly the kind of thing that NPR would fall all over itself to write about if it was a Democrat president doing it. But no, instead it's Trump. So we get no flowery language at all. We get no transformative, nothing like that. This problem exists because Kennedy's amazing idea wasn't funded, did not have enough of your money behind it. And then the evil Republican governor who then became president did something to make sure it wouldn't happen. And now the even more evil future Republican president, or at least presidential nominee, is vowing to take it even further. NPR is out of its mind. And I'm not even like, that's not even me just saying it. Mr. Berliner said it. NPR is out of its mind. And to draw it to our Monday episode, our Monday show where we discussed Iran, the same problem is underneath both. Both of them are under like a spiritual fog. It's the same Second Thessalonians chapter 2 problem. They did not love the truth. And as a result, God sent them a lie. And they're madly drunk on the lie, and there's nothing that they can do about it. Just like when you have had too much to drink and you have a clear moment and you realize, oh, hey, I've had too much to drink. That doesn't undo the fact that you had too much to drink, right? You're still drunk in that moment. You still can't get behind the car just because you realize that you had too much to drink, right? Becoming aware of the effect of a drug on you does not erase the effect of the drug on you. And so they're stuck. They're absolutely stuck in this spirit of falseness. And again, if you read all of Mr. Berliner's expose, his whistleblower article, you'll see that I'm not even making up any of this. I'm simply just like summarizing what he said. He goes on and on about how like the actual truth of Donald Trump was purposefully ignored. The truth, like, um, for 3 years, Mr. Berliner says for 3 years, Adam Schiff was one of the most common guests on NPR to talk about how evil Donald Trump was. And then you fast forward to the Mueller report, and we realize that nothing that Adam Schiff said was true. Did NPR report on that at all? No, not even a little bit. It's like oops, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. That just didn't happen. So we're going to move on and continue our ideological warfare here. So it's that kind of thing. When you know what the truth is and you choose against it on purpose, then God says, all right, you don't want the spirit of truth, then have a spirit of falseness instead. And they're under that. And that spirit is not going to serve them well. So to draw it into the scriptures, the Daniel 11 specifically, at the very end of time, we see this conflict. Verse 40 of Daniel 11, it says, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships, blah, 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 blah. The point of that, though, is that these two kind of demonic figures, the king of the north and the king of the south, they go at it one last time. The king of the north is so dominantly powerful, it wipes the king of the south off the map. And that, of course, leads to the end time prophecies and ultimately the return of Jesus Christ. But it's all just spiritual. It's a spiritual warfare. Now, we can kind of dig into that and we can broadly assign the king of the north as conservative religionism, right? Is the hearkening back to the French Revolution, this term, the right, came from there, and it referred to the people who were wanting to stick with the existing monarchy system backed by the church. They liked the religionism that was in play there. And then their opponents, the left, were the ones who didn't want anything to do with religion. They were the secularists, the naturalists, the humanists, right? Ultimately giving rise to socialism and communism and all the isms. So they're in this warfare, and religionism ultimately wins the day. But the truth underneath that surface is that neither one of them is Jesus. Not even the religionism is Jesus. Jesus is back in verse 22, dead on the cross, right? So what we are expecting is like an ideological clash between two sets of ideas, neither of which actually comes from God, even though one of them uses the name God all the time. So, therefore, the devil doesn't care who you are. Evil does not need a reason to be evil. And once we realize both the king of the north and the king of the south are wicked, then we can't look to one of them to take care of the other one, because even when it does, all we're left with is an equal or bigger problem than we started with. So, yeah, I don't like President Biden at all. And I don't like the effects that Trump derangement syndrome has had on our society, on NPR in particular. I don't like any of that. But am I looking to Donald Trump to be like the savior from that? I'm not. Nope. Or the Republicans or the conservative movement broadly, because it's not. It's just one king replacing the other king. The only actual solution is Jesus Christ. And Jesus does not appeal to the government for authority. I am of the firm belief that any church that appeals to the state for authority and power does not deserve authority or power, right? Because Jesus never did that, and his people should never do that either. And I'll illustrate this one last way in our closing minutes here out of Matthew chapter 27. Because who put Jesus on the cross? You'll tell me, it was the Romans that did it. Somebody else will tell me, it was the Jews that did it. But the Bible says it was both of them who did it. Right? Verse 1 and 2 of Matthew 27. When morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people, that's the Jews, plotted against Jesus to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, that's the Romans, the governor. And so it was this joint effort, whereas the Romans and the Jews really hated each other. They were at odds with each other, like the king of the north and the king of the south. So much so that like one generation after this happened, they went to war so badly that the temple was destroyed, never to be rebuilt. And then a generation after that, a second horrible war that almost destroyed both. And yet, when they have this common enemy of God, they team up. And that's what I'm expecting to happen in the context of Daniel 11. That these demonic forces that are just swallowing everything, one might give way to another, but they're both bad. And ultimately, they will team up for the purpose of the devil, which is against God. And if you're in any way familiar with the prophecies of Revelation, I hope that makes sense to you. All of that wickedness at the end of time is done in the name of God. So that's where we're going to call it quits for today. We have established so far that Iran fell victim to this like spirit of falseness a generation ago and is now kind of living in the consequences and fruits of it. We're seeing that society is fragile. It's, according to some people, it's falling apart. It's violent. It's scared. And all because of this spiritual problem. Now, NPR has also fallen under this like spirit of falseness, and it's just racing toward its own destruction. Its consumer base has just plummeted. Nobody listens anymore. Those who do already agree with this crazy ideological track that they're on. So nobody considers them to be any sort of like real news source anymore. They're just a hack news organization like all the others. When you come back on Friday, get ready for Friday, because the story we're going to share on Friday is just horrifically demonic and awful, and I am worried I won't even be able to verbalize it. But we're going to see how that same thing is happening, not on a national level, not on an institutional level, but on an individual level. And then we'll draw some conclusions thereof. So God bless you. I will see you Friday. Lord God, give us safety, give us peace, and give us wisdom until we can come back in a couple days to finish out our week-long discussion. Amen. Stay safe. God bless you. See you Friday.